So finish the sentence. The beginnings of beer in Colorado can be traced back to what?
Really, the beginnings of beer in Colorado can be traced to the gold rush. That was when, the first big crush of Euro-Americans came to Colorado and started the towns that we know of today as, big beer towns: Denver, Boulder, Fort Collins, all these.
So it's an immigration thing.
It's absolutely an immigration story. And in fact, the Central European immigrants who came to Colorado during the gold rush were the ones who brought beer, really just to sort of mine the miners, to make money off of the guys who were pulling the gold out of the ground.
So these are the people that started up saloons.
Yep.
These are the people that, for all intents and purposes, and saloons were kind of all-purpose areas in and of themselves.
Absolutely, yeah. So if you think about what was here before the gold rush, there's really no buildings to speak of, at least none that we would think of as large centers, like we have today. So a saloon had to serve many purposes. It was a restaurant, it was a social club, it was a bank, it was a place to get a drink, it was your post office, sometimes it was even your church.
So earliest beer makers were who?
Well, so it was a conglomerate of Central European immigrants who came to the U.S. for opportunity here, and they started the Rocky Mountain Brewery right at the confluence of the Platte and the Cherry Creek in 1859, right at the very beginning of the gold rush. And from there, the industry really just exploded, and really carried by German migrants coming here, bringing their knowledge of beer, brewing from their home country to Colorado.
So let's say we're back in those days. What kind of beer would you get at a saloon?
Well, most likely it would be lager, much like the sort of American style lagers we have today, but a little more flavorful, a little more malty, a little more hop character, just because it was that was the style at the time. And in fact, Colorado has a really fortuitous founding date, because our state was founded right around the time that the technological changes going on in the beer industry allowed them to make these light lagers that were sort of more flavorful. You could drink a little bit more of it because it wasn't so heavy like an ale. And this German brewing tradition was what came here in the 1840s and 1850s.
So you talk about technology. How much innovation was had back in those days that actually kind of put Colorado on the map in a beer perspective?
Yeah. So Colorado was also founded at sort of the beginning of the American Industrial Revolution. So the story of beer in Colorado is really the story of gold, but then the story of industrial minerals like oil, but mostly coal and natural. I'm going to back up at that. Coal, yeah, okay. So the Colorado's founded at the beginning of America's Industrial Revolution, and that really has a big effect on the beer industry here. It's not just that the gold was what brought people out to Colorado. There had to be something sustaining it, and that was mining for iron and for coal. Really, coal was what drove our transformation into the industrial capital of the Rocky Mountain West. And the brewers aren't stupid. They know that these new technologies, steam power and railroads, will allow them to make more beer than ever before, and then also to get it to consumers, when it's still nice and fresh.
So this was around the time the big breweries started popping up.
Many big breweries started popping up. So the biggest in the state around the turn of the century would have been the Zang Brewing Company, P.H. Zang. And in fact, their original brewery was right where the aquarium stands today in Denver. And they were making over 110,000 barrels of beer in 1910. To put that in perspective, Oscar Blues, the second biggest craft brewery in the state, made that much beer in 2018. So it's really an unbelievable amount of beer. And of course you have to mention Coors. Coors gets started out in Golden in 1873, and then by 1880, Adolf Coors has bought out his business partner, Jacob Schuler, and it's become the Coors Golden Brewery. And they're one of the biggest brewers in the state. And for a time there in the 1970s, after Prohibition, they're the only brewer in the state. So Coors really spans the whole history of beer in Colorado.
So what are some of the other big brewers that kind of popped up around the same time as Zang and Coors?
Yeah, so here in Denver you have the Neef Brothers Brewing Company. You have the Zang, like I said. Down in Pueblo you have the Walter Brewing Company, and in Trinidad you have Schneider Brewing. And so between those 5 or so breweries, 4 or 5 breweries, the state's really meeting a lot of its beer demand. But you also get really local breweries. You've got Crystal Springs Brewing and Ice Company up in Boulder, and a lot of other breweries that we would kind of consider craft or microbreweries today, up in the hills, down in South Park. Beer is an intensely local beverage, and particularly before the invention of refrigerated rail cars and industrial processes like pasteurization for keeping beer fresh, you really had to drink it within a few days of brewing it. So it's a beverage that depends on a concentration of a population to make it fresh and possible to have an industry.
All right, so it kind of brings us to Prohibition and the fact that Colorado actually went into Prohibition long before the rest of the country did.
Yep.
So kind of talk about the why, the mood at the time, and how that came to be, really.
Sure. So Colorado went dry 4 years before the rest of the country. We enacted Prohibition in 1916. The rest of the country didn't enact it until 1920. And part of the reason we go dry so early is just our drinking habits in Colorado were outrageously out of control. Historians estimate that people in the United States more broadly were drinking 2 gallons of pure alcohol every week prior to Prohibition. It's just an insane amount of alcohol. Denver itself, in the small area that is now sort of Lodo in central downtown, had more than 100 saloons. And this is, it's just fueling this massive drinking problem. And so people, particularly women, who are bearing an unequal burden of alcohol's negative effects, are eager to find a solution to all the social problems that they see related to alcohol. So it's not just domestic violence, but it's also, poverty and sort of what they perceived as a threat to the moral structure of the traditional American family. And so for these folks, banning alcohol was a panacea. It was a cure-all for a bunch of social ills, including overdrinking.
You brought up women. This is a time period where they were really able to kind of flex their influence, which they haven't really had the chance to do.
Absolutely. Yeah, so Colorado is the first state in the union to have women voting by popular referendum. So women achieved the right to vote in Colorado in 1893. And what they do with that power is really turn it to the immediate concerns that they have. And temperance movements, anti-drinking movements, were absolutely one of those things. Colorado had many attempts to go dry before 1916. And in fact, it was on the ballot in 1914 and many times before that. It just wasn't successful until 1916 when this combination of all these factors and social turbulence, including World War I, came around. Anti-German sentiment during World War I was running really high because we're at war with Germany. And that's where most of our beer is coming from. So drinking, this anti-war sentiment, the sense that we're in the middle of a social crisis and a health crisis, they really talked about it in the same way we talk about the opioid crisis today. It's a sense that there's a major public health crisis around drinking. That's what drove Prohibition in Colorado.
So this is also, during this time period is also when crime really ramped up. The idea was that Prohibition would stamp down on the drunkenness in general, and then it would stamp down on crime, but in fact it actually did the opposite.
Yeah, it's kind of intuitive if you think about it. Anytime you make something illegal that's really popular, people are going to continue doing it. They're just going to do it illegally now. And so that in and of itself caused the crime rate to rocket. But we also got the rise of the mafia in Colorado as a result of Prohibition, because the mafia was really organized in a way that enabled it to take advantage of this black market that was emerging for alcohol. And this isn't a uniquely Colorado story. We know all about Al Capone and mobsters in New York. You've seen The Godfather, and you've seen what's the HBO, The Sopranos. This is the origins of the mob in America, and in Colorado it was no different. We had many Italian immigrants who came here to work in the mines, to work in smelting plants in Pueblo and Trinidad. So that's really where the mob had concentrated its power, sort of the southern Front Range between Trinidad and Denver. It was the epicenter of bootlegging in Colorado during Prohibition.
This was also the rise of the first statewide beer movement. police agency as well.
It was, yeah. So some of the very first police agencies, like the Colorado Rangers, were established directly in response to the threat that the mob was playing, and also out of basically frustration with the inability of local police departments to tamp down on the drinking rates. It became evident by about 1920 that the local cops just weren't up to the job. And in fact, one wag in the Denver Post wrote an op-ed and said it would be great if the Denver Police Department could catch anything other than a cold in response to the rising crime rates.
I like that. So then let's kind of move past Prohibition. When it ended.
Sure.
When Prohibition.
Do you want me to take you through that? I mean, I can talk through.
Well, I'm trying to bridge the gap here, just basically like how many breweries before Prohibition, how
Gotcha.
many breweries after.
Yeah.
So let's go with
Sure.
there.
Yeah, you got it. So Prohibition comes to an end in 1933 nationally. And in fact, brewers in Colorado were really ready to take advantage. This is where we get 3-2 beer as an expedient to make brewing and selling beer happen more quickly. The government legalized low alcohol beer, which is 3.2%. They thought they classified it as non-intoxicating. And so several breweries in Colorado were ready, including Coors. We had 4 breweries in the state that survived. Out of a pre-Prohibition high of about 26 breweries, only 4 survived. So we have Coors and Golden, of course. We had the Tivoli Brewing Company, which survives today as Tivoli Brewing. In Denver, there was Walter in Pueblo and Schneider in Trinidad. And of those 4, really only Coors survived intact until today. They've revitalized Tivoli and Walter, but Schneider never made it back.
This was also around the time that beer started being used as the American dream, marketing an American dream.
Mm-hmm.
It's also around the time, it wasn't long after that Coors started marketing Colorado.
Absolutely.
Beer. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So coming out of the Second World War and out of Prohibition, brewers are terrified that Americans are going to want to return to Prohibition. And so what they do is they start running this series of ads called the Beer Belongs ads that marketed beer as the safe alternative to intoxicating liquors. But also, they used this Norman Rockwell-esque American dream imagery to connect beer to the good life. And so what you see are these suburban scenes with happy families drinking beer, and the message, of course, is, this is part of your right as an American to pursue happiness, and beer is a big part of that. In Colorado, Coors benefited from this, but also Coors was very savvy about their marketing, even up in before Prohibition. They've long been trading on Colorado's reputation for high country beauty. Starting in the 30s, Coors was using the slogan "Brewed with pure Rocky Mountain spring water" to draw that connection between the specialness of the place where it's brewed and the flavor of the beer. And coming out of World War II, this rising awareness of environmental issues, this rising desire among Americans to live in a place where you could easily get outside to go skiing or hiking or be out in the mountains. Coors was really savvy. They understood that this desire could help them brand their beer. What I don't think they fully got was the extent to which they would brand Colorado and make it a place that people wanted to move to, people wanted to come vacation in, because of all the things that they said made their beer special.
So let's backtrack just a little bit to the ads that were going out there. You made a mention of something the last time I was here that was really interesting. When you're looking at the ads, something that's missing.
Yes. So if you look through these ads, they ran from 1947 to 1945 to 1957, and out of 160 of these ads, there isn't a single person of color in any of the ads. And it sends this really unmistakable message about who the American dream is supposed to be for. And if you look at the history of who's been buying beer since World War II, it's been a major transformation, but we've sort of gone on these waves, where craft beer has become particularly associated with, white men living in urban areas, not so much with other folks of color. And that can be traced really back to those ads, sending that message that beer is connected to the American dream and the American dream is for white folks.
Okay. So fast forward a little bit back to the Coors branding Colorado. The fact that they didn't really maybe realize that that's what they were doing. Can and I don't know if you can speak to this, but can you draw a correlation between the time that started happening to like population boom?
Totally. So Coors really comes on the scene in a strong way in the midst of a massive population boom in Colorado that's primarily driven by, federal investment in Colorado. You've got these openings of different labs and institutions all around the state, massive military presence with Rocky Flats and the Air Force Academy and NORAD down in Colorado Springs. But it's also that people are realizing that they can choose where they want to live. For the first time really in American history, people are choosing where they want to live based on the amenities that place provides, and not based on where they have to live for their job.
So let's move forward into the rise of the home brewing, the rise of the craft beer industry, how did it begin in Colorado?
Craft brewing begins in Colorado really as home brewing. There's this collection of folks who have all moved here starting in the early 70s, basically because of what we already know. Colorado's a great place to live. And in the 70s, there was this culture of reacting against big, mass-produced, mass-marketed food products and beer. And, at the time, Colorado really only had one brewery, and that would have been Coors. And they were making their product, which is a very light in flavor, very light in alcohol American lager. And that's really all that was available. I mean, if you think about it, there was, just a few small breweries around the country who were making anything other than light American lager at the time. And so, because these folks had either been GIs and they had traveled or fought a war in Europe, or because they had been traveling around the world, they knew that there were other beers out there. They'd been to Belgium, they'd been to Germany, they'd been to France. They know that there's this brewing tradition that's deeper than just, American style lager. And so they figured, hey, we could probably do this at home. We know how to make beer out of malt syrup, which was a creation during Prohibition, where, these companies like Pabst would make a malt syrup like we make today for home brewing, and then they would say, absolutely don't add 5 gallons of water to this and keep it in a dark, cool place with some brewer's yeast for 5 days. Wink, wink. So home brewing was a pretty well-established tradition, but what caused it to take root as the sort of beginning of craft beer in Colorado was a new kind of Westerner. Folks who we in this exhibit and folks who we as historians call new Westerners. They're folks who move here because of the amenities. They have high-paying jobs, so they can afford to pay a little more for their beer. At the end of the day of hiking or skiing, which were super popular at the time and still remain so, it tasted great to get a beer, and it still does. It's a big part of our culture here in Colorado. It's just back then, it was probably your buddy's home brew and not necessarily a craft beer made by somebody who knows what they're doing. But from there, it really established this market. Drinking craft beer put you in the know. It made you cool. It made you someone who knew something about something that not a lot of people knew. And so this tradition of making flavorful beers that weren't necessarily lagers, like amber ales or India Pale Ales, this grew out of home brewing because it was a unique beverage that tasted different and it was cool.
It's also another example of how, of like an international influence. Whereas like the international influence that started all of this back in the gold rush, we have an international influence that's like bringing up this craft beer industry.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think, it's really hard to overstate the degree to which Prohibition caused the rise of craft beer in America. It really absolutely ruined our flavor, our palates. Prohibition ruined our palate for beer. And it made us think that, hey, all there is in terms of beer is this light American lager, which is great if that's what you want. But there's this whole other world of beer out there that had to sort of be re-imported after World War II, and particularly in the 1980s and 1990s as craft brewing really took off.
So bring us home with rise of home brewing, craft breweries started popping up. It was basically a craft beer boom in Colorado.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. The early 90s saw a massive explosion of interest in craft beer, but it wasn't until the early 2000s that we get what we really think of as Colorado's craft beer scene today. During the early 2000s, the market for beer was really at one of its high points in history, and it was relatively easy to find a warehouse, find a sort of a makerspace where you could have a few brew kettles and just start making your beer. And people really grabbed onto this, and it was sort of returned to this idea of the local as being something that is desirable, but also I think it's a return to the idea that beer is part of culture. And in Colorado, I think that's especially true. It's not just a quirk of Colorado that we have this beer industry. It's because of our amenity culture. And people who move here look for that. That's what is desirable about Colorado. It's not just that there's great places to hike and ski and bike, but it's also that there's great places to go and hang out with your friends after you're done doing that, or even if you don't like to do those things. You can create this community around a beverage. And I think that really brings us all the way back to 1859. Because even though we're not getting our mail or sleeping in craft breweries today like we would have, in 1859 at the beginning of the gold rush, but it's still where we meet to hang out with our friends. It's still a community. It's still, it's an entrepreneurial business. I'm sitting in front of this wall we call Pints Peak. It's a beer glass from every brewery in the state. And each one of those is a business. It's somebody's dream that they opened and that they pursued. And I think it says something about Colorado's culture, not only that they can survive here, but that they're thriving.
Cool. So a couple other just kind of side questions.
Sure.
What are well, actually, before I do that, what do you think the future holds?
Man, looking into my craft beer crystal ball, I foresee the local brew pub, the one that you can walk to from your house, those are going to be just fine. It's tough to convince me, at least, to drive past my local to go somewhere else if I can just walk to the nearest brewery. And I think if you start to think about craft breweries as less about beer and brewing and more like you would think about a neighborhood restaurant, I think it starts to make sense because it's a community gathering place. It's a place that becomes part of your routine and your habit, and also your people. That's where you meet your peeps. And I think that the larger breweries will continue to do well because they have lots of money and lots of resources. And the smaller breweries will continue to do well. The ones that are struggling at the moment are the mid-sized ones, the regional ones that are sort of getting squeezed from both sides as a new generation of drinkers is really coming onto the market. You see things like hard seltzer taking a big chunk out of the beer market now. And it's understandable that people's tastes change over time, just like, amber ale was immensely popular in the early 90s. You've got beers like 90 Shilling from Odell, Fat Tire, of course, from New Belgium. Those aren't the best-selling, most popular beers among, craft brewing folks these days. People are looking more for the unique, the sour, the IPA. These are sort of the categories that you see often. And it's because tastes change. Well, tastes changed again. We're changing back more towards whiskey and other malted beverages. So, from that standpoint, it's hard to tell. I think we have at least established that there's a lot of different kinds of beer out there, and I think we'll continue seeing innovation, especially in Colorado, as we go forward.
Cool. So, a few other questions outside of this. What are some of the breweries that you think really shaped Colorado?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. Well, you got to start with Coors. I mean, regardless of how you feel about their products, Coors is Colorado's beer, and it has been, since the 1890s, really. They were the only brewery that came back and survived all the way from Prohibition to now. And like I said, they're really the brewery that put Colorado on the map as a beer destination. Not only that, they were instrumental in establishing craft beer. The knowledge and the supply chain that Coors built up in this state, the lobbying power that they had, they were more than willing to lend that to the craft beer industry because, to their credit, they saw that what's good for beer is what's good for beer. And they didn't distinguish between their business and craft beer. So for that reason, I think, Coors is our brewery. In terms of craft brewing, though, it's impossible to overstate the role of Boulder Beer. They were the first non-coastal craft brewery in the nation, and they were up in Boulder. They got started in a goat shed near Lyons, and so they're sort of that example of the hacker DIY home brewer turned pro. And they got started in 1979, so they're really early in the state's beer history, and they established this taste for beer, for craft beer, that we all still pursue. Blue Moon is a Coors product. That's probably the most effective gateway to craft beer that's ever been, because it's just delicious and drinkable. You can't talk about craft beer in Colorado without talking about New Belgium. They're the third largest, or they're one of the largest craft breweries in the nation now, and they were founded in Fort Collins. And I think that their focus on sustainability and trying to make a pretty environmentally unfriendly industry a little more green, that set the stage for a lot of marketing and a lot of, it set the stage for a lot of the attitudes that we assume craft brewers are going to be holding about the environment and about their role in preserving the environment. And then, of course, you can't wrap up without talking about some of the Southern Colorado brewers. Walter Brewing Company is a perfect example down in Pueblo. They were a large brewing company prior to Prohibition. They came back after Prohibition. They shut down. They were rebought. And in those sort of ups and downs and those waves of success, you really see the waves of success in the beer industry in Colorado overall.
And then the other thing I wanted to ask you about is we're talking to Charlie next week.
Oh, great.
So I want to just kind of get your take on him.
Yeah. So without Charlie Papazian, we don't have craft beer in Colorado. I'm convinced. Charlie was really the one who not only established the craft beer industry here, just through his enthusiasm and his ability to bring people together and his knowledge of beer, but it was it's really his personality that's infused into our culture around craft beer here. And he did that by creating the American Homebrewing Association and their newsletter, Zymergy, which went out all across the country, but also all across Colorado. And his interests, outdoor recreation, hiking, being outside, that was infused in the culture and in the DNA of the magazine. And I think it got infused in the culture and DNA of craft beer in Colorado through Charlie. Plus, he has an amazing palate, so, it's impressive.
Final thoughts?
That's a great question. I think beer is important to Colorado because it tells us who we are as a people and as a state. Even if you don't drink beer, even if you don't drink, your life has been affected in some way by beer. And that's been true ever since the very beginning. Beer was one of those very few things that wasn't mythologized as the gold rush was happening in Colorado. It's sort of an on-the-ground experience. And if you look at the way people were talking about beer and thinking about beer and making beer, it really tells you about their desires and their world and the things that they wanted out of their lives. And that's why I think it's really important for us to understand the role that beer has played here in this state.
And one final question.
Yeah.
So what's a lesson that can be learned?
Oh, okay.
Looking back at our history from Gold Rush to today, what is a lesson that can be learned by people today?
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily from a beer standpoint, but from like a life, because there's a lot of similarities between the past and today.
Yeah, totally.
With polarization of people.
Yeah.
And our political system. I'm not even going to start there. But like looking back, what is a lesson that someone from today?
Yeah. I think the biggest lesson you can learn about our history by looking at beer is about unintended consequences. We didn't necessarily intend to have a brewing industry here, but we did. And it powered the rise of all of these saloons, and that powered the rise of alcoholism, which powered the rise of Prohibition, which, when it was repealed, helped bring Colorado sort of out of the Great Depression and out of the post-war years and put it onto this, track where we are one of the strongest economies in the state today. None of that was on purpose. The brewers who started making beer in Colorado in 1859 didn't know that they were putting us on this track to have 360 breweries today. It's just sort of this unintentional conglomeration of events that come together to produce this moment where we're living now. And I think that's the key to beer, is we can see ourselves in our beers if we just look closely.